Okay, we're going to begin. Make sure you're muted to our presentation on serving neurodiverse individuals as professional social workers. This session is being recorded, and live captions are enabled and can be toggled on and off as needed. If you are wanting to receive CU credits for this presentation, please make sure to sign in if you haven't already. You can use the QR code on the screen as well as the link. It is also being put in the chat box. I also make sure you know that to receive CU credits, there's also an evaluation at the very end. So make sure you do that as well to receive both 2 credits. There is no Q&A window, so disregard that on the screen. Please use the chat box for any questions and also for general conversation throughout the presentation. If you have any tech issues, please direct that to me, and I will help you with that. And that's my name. My name is Helene Diamond. I am the council chair for the NASW California DisAbilities Council. You should have all received the slides and email that I sent out. They'll also be sent to you again with the recording when it is available. Please, the next slide, Tina. Just briefly about our council, which is the DisAbilities Council. Our mission is to provide an inclusive space for social workers of all abilities to network and collectively address disability-related concerns through education, resources, peer support, and advocacy efforts. The term disability is all-inclusive. That includes those that are visible, invisible, physical, sensory, emotional, and/or neurodiverse. We have monthly council meetings, which all are welcome to attend. That includes NASW members, non-members, as well as their allies.
Also count the number of seats and work with our...
Please, everyone, mute yourselves. Thank you. Our next council meeting is Thursday, May 16th from 7 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and they're all via Zoom. If you want more information about our council, if you're interested in getting involved, please contact us. Our email is on the screen. It'll also be in the chat box. It's NASW-CA DisAbilitiesCouncil@gmail.com. You can also look us up on Facebook. Just search NASW California Chapter DisAbilities Council. And now Victor J. will introduce our presenters. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome all. This is Victor, and I have the honor of introducing our 2 very remarkable presenters today whose expertise and commitment shine very brightly in their fields, Dr. Deborah Waters-Roman and Christina or Tina Paddock. Dr. Deborah Waters-Roman is both a licensed clinical social worker and clinical psychologist in California, who serves as clinical associate professor at the University of Southern California School of Social Work. Prior to USC, Dr. Waters-Roman worked for the LA County Department of Children and Family Services. She provides mental health services to trauma survivors of all ages. In addition, she specializes in providing services to children on the autism spectrum and their families. Tina Paddock is a licensed clinical social worker who serves as Associate Professor of Practicum Education, also at the USC School of Social Work. As former program specialist with the LA County Department of Children and Family Services, Tina provided mental health care to children and families involved in public child welfare and special needs cases. With a special interest in neurodiversity, she has served as Wellness Program Manager for South Central LA Regional Center and sits on USC's Autism Committee. Tina has had other leadership positions, including recently serving as Vice President of Membership on the NASW California Chapter Board. She's currently pursuing a doctorate in policy, planning, and program development at USC's School of Public Policy, focusing on integrating micro and macro level practice. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah Waters-Roman and Tina Paddock.
Thank you, Helene and Victor. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you for those beautiful introductions. One thing about the NASW California DisAbilities Council, both Deborah and I are members, and it's been such a pleasure to be on the council and just not only the learning and trainings that they provide, but also just to connect with other individuals and other allies. And so I hope maybe we could put the link in the chat box as well. I mean, Helene's information, if you can definitely join the council. It's been just a wonderful, wonderful experience. It's been around for a long time under Helene's leadership. So she's been doing such a great job. So hope you can join us. But anyway, today we are again going to talk about understanding and serving neurodiverse individuals as social workers. Again, this is a CEU class, so please make sure you have signed in. I don't know if we're going to put that information also in the chat box in case people weren't able to get it, but we will definitely review it again at the end. We just hope you enjoy the presentation today. While we go through the presentation, please feel free to put any questions in the chat box and we'll go through them and try to answer them as we can. Also at the end, we'll leave some time for also questions and answers. But I'm going to get us started out before I turn it over to Deborah. But Deborah, before we start, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I would just like to echo your words,
Okay.
Tina, and thank Victor and Helene for the lovely introductions and for all the wonderful work of the committee. I have to apologize. I'm battling a respiratory infection, so I apologize. I may sound a little congested, but wanted to be here to share this important information with you. And I just want to thank the DisAbilities Council at NASW for bringing light to such important issues. I know I've worked a long time with neurodiverse individuals. I'm a parent of an adult son who is on the autism spectrum, and I also have a daughter who has ADHD, and they've often felt that neurodiverse individuals weren't included at the table. And this committee has been a great way. This council been a great way of bringing neurodiverse individuals to the table and into the conversation. So much. Thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for being here and for showing your interest in this important topic.
Thank you, Deborah. Okay, so our session objectives today is basically what we're going to be going over is two neurodevelopmental diagnoses, autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. We know that there's others that fall under the umbrella of neurodivergence. For example, like Deborah, one of my interests in terms of joining the Autism Committee as well as joining the DisAbilities Committee is my daughter has dyslexia. And that has been something we've navigated in the school system. She is right now 6th grade and doing pretty well. So I know we all came together with our own personal interest with neurodiversity. So we'll be able to hope that you'll be able to translate this knowledge into an understanding of the characteristics, strengths, and challenges for neurodiverse individuals. And also we'll have you learn, or we'll have a discussion about specific strategies you can use as working with neurodiverse individuals as social workers. Again, our goal always is to align techniques to really support inclusion and also our support of neurodiverse individuals. And then again, we always want to make sure that we look within an intersectional lens. And actually, in the past, we've done this presentation with a lovely social worker who is all the way across the country right now at Rutgers University. So you may see some Rutgers logos on some of the slides. She's done doctoral work specifically on looking at Latinx individuals' experiences with autism and kind of the services and supports available, really looking at a gap of research, looking at, individuals of color and neurodiversity. So you'll see that Rutgers logo on some of the slides, and she has some really good information looking at kind of an intersectional lens, which we really have appreciated her sharing with us. So what we thought we would do today, before we get started, we're first going to go over autism spectrum disorder, is kind of do a fun little quiz here, but with no pressure, called Fact or Fiction, and just to kind of give us a sense of where you're at, or where we're all at in terms of understanding neurodivergence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read one of the statements, and then if you could put in the chat box, I know Helene, Deborah, and Victor could be looking at the chat box for me. If you think it's fact or fiction. So we're going to use the words fact or fiction. So the first one is individuals with ASD usually have cognitive impairments or learning difficulties. Fact or fiction? And I'll see if I can look also in the chat. So put in the chat box, fact or fiction.
A lot of fictions, Tina.
A lot of fictions. Thank you, Deborah.
Mostly fictions. Yes, almost
Oh,
all
good.
fiction.
I see
Yes.
one fact.
What? Oh, okay.
There's one fact in there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is fiction. I know that many of us that are joining today, again, as Deborah was saying, have that special interest in neurodivergence because of our own personal experiences or those within our family. And yes, I mean, there can be, at the regional center, of course, we served a number of individuals with ASD. Was not typical that ASD individuals had cognitive impairments or learning difficulties, but again, that can happen. I think the main reason we put this in, which Deborah is going to go over, so I'm not going to go over it in detail, is that, there's oftentimes that myth out there that those with ASD might not have the same cognitive abilities as those, as others would have. Just want to dispel that myth. Individuals with ASD are usually not social and prefer not to have friends. Fact or fiction? What do you see, Deborah and Helene?
Fiction so far.
Okay, good. Yeah.
All fictions.
Yeah, and a lot of work Deborah and I have been doing, and Deborah, please chime in, is we've done some work with the Autism Committee at USC, and one of the goals of the Autism Committee is to really create an inclusive campus for those students on the autism spectrum. And we've done surveys just about their experiences on campus. A lot of them just express really wanting those resources to really connect with others and to socialize and to make friends. So again, this is another myth that we want to dispel. And we've had things on campus such as movie night and other things to really connect folks on the autism spectrum. So individuals diagnosed with ASD are mostly male. Fact or fiction? What do you see?
Yes, fact.
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 Lots of facts.
Yes, see, we have such
All
a great group here. Yeah, so fact, you're right. And Deborah's going to go over this a little bit more. And a lot of it is, I think in the past, we have not reached out to those, or we maybe have misdiagnosed those that are female who may be on the autism spectrum. So we're going to go over that a little bit more. Black, Indigenous people of color are less likely to have autism than white individuals. Fact or fiction?
Fiction.
Yeah. And Deborah's going to go over some of the research with this, and that, again, this is a real gap in the research, and there tends to be a lot of underdiagnosis there. Again, that same state, maybe not with us as a group, but still within the broader public, that idea that those with autism spectrum are white and male. So, okay. So let's go to the next. Next one's going to be ADHD. And then I'm going to turn over to Deborah. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, fact or fiction? Individuals with ADHD were diagnosed in childhood. Is that fact or fiction?
Fiction, fact,
fact.
fiction.
Yeah, I mean, many times they are diagnosed in childhood because of, as we know, difficulties within the classroom. Okay, so but then we've seen more and more now where people are getting diagnosed in adulthood. I'm kind of realizing in adulthood that they do have ADHD and then getting diagnosed. Next one, individuals with ADHD may need additional support with organizing a schedule and assignments. Fact or fiction?
Fact.
Fiction, fact.
Yeah.
Lots of facts.
Fact. Yes, that's a big part of ADHD, needing those additional supports. And again, at the university level, we have our Office for Student Accessibility Services, and then that's where our students will go to get accommodations, which they share with their professors if they would like to. Okay, last one. Individuals may present differently between men and women.
Fact.
Yes, definitely. There is some differences between men and women that research has shown. So again, that's why it's so important that we take kind of an intersectionality lens or intersectional lens where we look at some of these neurodivergent areas, just to make sure that we're including everybody, because there can be some presentations that are different. Well, thank you. Right, Deborah, A+?
Yes, A+ for everyone.
Okay, thank you. So just to get us started, so now I'm going to go over a little bit about the difference between neurodiverse and neurodivergent. I know for some of you on this at the CU training, this may just be, I know this already, this is completely understandable, or of course I know about this, but for some, this is very new. And I think one of our roles too as social workers who are allies, who are neurodivergent ourselves, that we can really be, really make sure that we provide education to the public and others about what neurodiverse and neurodivergent means. So those are interchangeable. I find that some people like to use neurodivergent a little better, a little more, and that's been for a while there. So a little bit used more than neurodiverse. But basically, neurodiversity describes the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in many different ways. And there is no one right way. So this is what we really need to emphasize with others around us who may not understand as much about neurodiversity. There may not be one right way of thinking, learning, and behaving, and differences are not viewed as deficits. So I really love this this definition. I mean, I know in education, I mean, the idea is that, why children receive additional services to support their educational goals is that really the classrooms aren't made for our neurodiverse and neurodivergent individuals. That does not mean that they're any less capable or less bright than others. So you'll see here, we love this diagram that Deborah and I like to include because it's an umbrella, and underneath it is all the different ones that fall under neurodiversity. You'll see there. Interestingly, though, one thing that sometimes gets confused with regional center services, when I worked at the regional center, is sometimes we would have individuals come in with ADHD, maybe expecting that they would receive services. But again, the only things that regional center include, will fund is those that have developmental disorders, which autism is included under, but ADHD isn't. So again, that's one thing that kind of would come up at the regional center. Again, neurotypical refers to someone who has brain functions, behaviors, and learning processes that are considered typical, that many of our functions in society were built around. And then we're going to get more into intersectionality throughout our presentation, but Deborah and I really love this slide. Again, these last two slides were due to our colleague over at Rutgers University, Professor Marisol, or Dr. Marisol now. This was turned by, Kimberly Crenshaw, one of our UCLA professors of law. Really to explain identity-based interlocking forms of oppression within society. We just want to make sure that sometimes when we come to intersectionality, we think of all these other identities, but sometimes what we call ability may not be always included. So we want to make sure that we really look within that intersectional lens where individuals experience oppression or discrimination as well as privilege. And, what Crenshaw did a lot of work noting that, those with multiple oppressed and minoritized identities, that's what she called them, or intersectional identities, encounter increased risks of negative health outcomes. So the importance of why we do this work. And again, we're very hopeful because what Deborah and I have found is, more of the research is really looking at some of these gaps with, we're looking at autism, when looking at ADHD, where we haven't included individuals, and really to make sure we look at that to get best, to look at best practices, to support individuals, and also including individuals on the autism spectrum, as well as with ADHD within the recommendations when it comes to doing that research. So lastly, I'm going to talk about strength-based language. I know as social workers, we come from a strength-based perspective. I think that's just what we learn in social work school. But again, just a reminder that, words are powerful and can make a person feel included, accepted, and valued. And again, kind of looking at some of our, going back to cognitive behavioral therapy here, that really the language we use really does connect to how we, our thoughts and attitudes and how we behave. So again, just to be mindful of that, because oftentimes we think of microaggressions, and this is me sometimes, I'll think of microaggressions happening to those individuals that, based on ethnicity or race. But again, we do have microaggressions from those, based on people's neurodivergence. So again, we as social workers can be mindful of that, as well as, provide education to others about that as well. So again, avoid functioning labels. I know when I started early on, very early in my career, I worked at the Autism Center or interned at Claremont, and we definitely used functioning labels. That was back in the late 80s and 90s. This person is high functioning, this person is low functioning, is this and this. So we want to, try to be as thoughtful not to include those, but to really try to kind of change how we look at this. And Deborah's going to talk about this more about, I know one of the diagnostic criteria for autism is having those restrictive fixated interests, but special interest areas.
Hello?
Deborah and I have done a lot of work with like social
Hey, I'm good.
skills
How are
groups.
you?
And I'm going to mute right now, with social skills groups. And I think one thing we've done when we worked with kids doing social skills groups, we have a lesson on special interests, right, Deborah? We don't call it restrictive or fixated interests. We talk about your special interest and how you can learn about others' interests and share your special interests, but be open to others' interests. So that's some learning. And then identity first or person first language. So it kind of goes back and forth. I think for me, for a while there, it was thought that, saying individuals with autism as like a part of their identity. But sometimes people, right, Deborah, want to use autistic individuals. So it's really asking what the individual prefers, I think is really important, and not assuming. And then again, before I turn over to Deborah, all people have individual abilities, strengths, and interests. So we always want to come from that strength-based when we're working with individuals who are neurodivergent. But I think we wanted to make sure to include this important slide. Now I'm going to turn it over to Deborah for autism spectrum disorder. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina.
Oh, you're welcome.
Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. In these next few slides, I'm just going to talk a little bit about autism. I want to respect the fact that many of you, if not all of you, are, all certainly are professionals in this field, and many of you may already have a lot of knowledge and expertise in this area. So we definitely want to value that. And if you have anything you would like to share that you feel would be helpful towards this discussion, please feel free to go ahead and include those comments in the chat box. One thing that I'd like to say before I start talking about autism, and I apologize, I can't remember the individual's name, but there was a gentleman that made a quote that was, once you've met one person on the autism spectrum, you have met one person on the autism spectrum. And I love that quote because I think it really recognizes the importance of not stereotyping and not making a lot of assumptions about what autism is. And of course, this can happen for, making assumptions, stereotypes can happen for a number of different conditions, but I think lots of times it can happen with autism. I know lots of people used to tell me, they saw Rain Man and they thought everybody that had autism looked like Dustin Hoffman did in the Rain Man movie, or they envisioned someone with autism as a child, who's wearing a helmet and they're banging their head on the wall. So a lot of kind of misperceptions and stereotypes about what autism is. And one of the ones that we were talking about earlier that Tina had in the quiz is that this idea that individuals or most individuals on the spectrum may have some type of intellectual or cognitive challenges. And as we look here at the diagnostic criteria from DSM-5-TR, right, we see that that's not even a requirement for autism. So again, that's kind of one of those stereotypes that we like to challenge. So in looking at the diagnostic criteria here, what we do need in order for a diagnosis of autism is a deficit in social communication and social interaction skills. So Tina and I have worked a lot with individuals on the spectrum. And it's interesting because individuals on the spectrum, and this includes my son, are often in speech therapy. And they're not in speech therapy because they can't be understood or they don't know how to use words correctly. They're often in speech therapy because they lack some of those pragmatic skills. So how do you engage in a conversation? How do you have a back and forth dialogue with an individual? How do you talk to somebody about something that maybe is not of interest to you, but is interest to them? So they actually participate in speech therapy in order to practice those pragmatic communication skills, kind of those social norms and skills. And one thing I like to mention when I start talking about autism is I think if most of us look back and we think about growing up, I don't think we can pinpoint anybody necessarily teaching us social rules or social norms about communication or eye contact. You probably don't remember anybody sitting you down and saying, this is eye contact and this is how it works, right? It's something that you just probably learned through social modeling by seeing other individuals around you. And oftentimes with individuals on the spectrum, they simply don't acquire those same social skills that a neurotypical individual might. That doesn't mean that they can't. They certainly can, but they may have to learn them the same way that you and I would have to learn a foreign language. So I think that helps always keep things in context for myself. Another is the restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. Again, an individual on the spectrum, not all, but some, may become very fascinated with a particular topic. I know a lot of the individuals, children I've worked with who are now adults, I've seen go through Thomas the Train, Star Wars, can be very big as well. For my own son, he is very fascinated with American history and ended up turning that into his college degree. So turning that into a strength, right? But again, if they have this real dedication to certain topics, it can interfere sometimes with social relationships when their peers might want to talk about something else. And they need to be able to understand that and make those shifts as well. Symptoms are present since early development. I know I do some work with the regional center I'll talk about a little later on, but many psychologists at the regional center who are experts in diagnosing autism because they see it so often, believe now that autism can be recognized as early as 18 months. Not always that early, but again, that it can be recognized that early. I know at the regional center, sometimes if there have been siblings, so there's been a history of autism in the family, they'll evaluate and look at new siblings to see if there's any signs of autism. And symptoms have to cause significant impairment in daily functioning. So you have all these symptoms and they really have to get in the way, right, of the individual's ability to function and successfully carry out their daily activities. And as a part of the autism community at USC, Tina and I see this a lot because what we see happen is we see students come to USC, they're 18 and they have decided, I'm not telling anyone I have autism. You know, I've spent my whole life being diagnosed, being told, having other people know. I don't want anyone to know now. I'm going to come and I'm not going to tell anybody. Well, then they come to us about midway through the first semester because they're starting to encounter some challenges, right? Maybe they're not getting along with their roommate. Maybe they're having some academic challenges because they don't have the accommodations that they might have had during high school. So that's where you see the symptoms impact the ability to function. And then oftentimes those students at that point are recognizing that maybe they need to revisit looking at accessing some supportive services. Now, this next fact down here, I find fascinating. This came out from the CDC that now says that 1 in every 36 children will be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And if you think about that, that's one child in almost every typical classroom. And every time the CDC comes out with new numbers, the number of children who are being diagnosed on the spectrum is going up. So there's a lot of research into why is that happening? Is it because children are being more accurately diagnosed now? Children who were being diagnosed with other things are now being appropriately diagnosed with autism. Are more females being diagnosed? But there's a lot of research that's going into why is this number continuing to increase? But the thing that stands out for me with this statistic is as there are a lot of individuals in society on the spectrum. And so as social workers, I'm sure you guys have all or will encounter individuals on the spectrum. And so it's a population that's definitely here to stay. And I think as social workers, we have an ethical responsibility to provide effective services to this group of individuals that continues to grow. Next slide, Tina. Okay. And what you might notice in individuals with autism spectrum disorder, and what we did here is you're not going to see this in everybody with autism. Some individuals may have some of these, some may have none, as we said in the beginning. It presents uniquely in each individual, but these are some of the more common characteristics you may notice. You may notice awkward eye contact, posture and or gestures. You'll hear a lot that individuals on the spectrum, people will say, oh, you know, they don't make eye contact or they look very stiff or rigid. Difficulty with changes in routine, policies, etc. So if you're working with an individual on the spectrum, if it's a child, if there's last minute changes in routine around school, something like there's going to be a substitute teacher, that can be dysregulating to a child on the spectrum. If it's an adult and things have been done the same way for a long time, and now all of a sudden they're going to be done differently, that can be difficult for an individual on the spectrum. So sometimes individuals on the spectrum have some difficulty managing changes. And as social workers, we're going to talk about strategies we can equip individuals with to help them manage these changes. You guys may have seen their sensory sensitivity to light, sounds, touch, and smells. My son, I know, used to have to put his socks on and off, right? Until they felt just right. They didn't feel right, right? So they're oftentimes called, you know, the princess and the pea, where they can feel the pea 9 mattresses down, right? And if you, for example, are a professor, or if you're a social worker practicing in an office and you have those old fluorescent lights, I don't know if you guys know those lights, they kind of buzz and they hum. I never really noticed it until I stopped and listened, and they do make a noise, right? And that can be distracting for someone who's on the spectrum and can make it more difficult for them to concentrate. For children, tags that get in their clothes may bother them. Certain textures of food may bother them. Sometimes individuals on the spectrum don't like particular textures in their food. They may have a delayed response, and sometimes that just has to do with the fact that the individual on the spectrum, and these could be for other neurodiverse conditions as well, just process information a little bit differently. So it may take them a little bit longer to respond. And that doesn't mean that they're not paying attention or they're not thinking about it. There may just be some processing differences. They may misunderstand tone of voice, jokes, facial expressions, sarcasm, and other subtle messages. What I've noticed a lot with the individuals that I work with on the spectrum is they can be very concrete thinkers. And so they don't necessarily like a lot of abstract concepts or a lot of ambiguity. They like more of the factual information and may misunderstand some of those other things like jokes. There may be oddities in vocal pitch, volume, and intonation. A lot of people will tell me, oh, you know, they've noticed individuals on the spectrum can have a very flat tone of voice, right? Their voice doesn't really go up and down or modulate the way as other individuals do. They may have some difficulty working in groups, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, seeing others' perspectives. And I think oftentimes when we look at these two, difficulty working in groups and seeing others' perspectives, I think sometimes there's a misperception that individuals on the spectrum can be stubborn or selfish, right? It's kind of like their way or the highway. And I don't think that's true at all. In most cases, I think what it is lots of times when individuals on the spectrum have to work in groups because they lack sometimes that social understanding, it can be a little bit anxiety provoking for them, right? Are the other group members going to like me? Are they going to think my ideas are stupid, right? And then that can impact kind of the way they behave in the group, and that might be misunderstood. I've done a lot of work with individuals on the spectrum, and as Tina mentioned, it's a myth that they don't want to be social or they don't want to have friends. They actually do, but because it's been difficult for them to establish friendships, they can become very anxious when they're placed in social situations. So again, there's a lot of interventions that can be provided to help individuals. And that's something you can see into adulthood, right? Tina and I know adults on the spectrum who still have a hard time with social situations, groups, that type of a thing. And then lastly, understanding vague instructions, right? Because that kind of comes back to like in the very concrete, clear directions or way of thinking. Next, Tina. Okay, and then we also like to look at the strengths. We talked about some of the challenges, but as Tina mentioned, we really like to look at neurodiversity from a strength-based perspective. And we like neurodiverse individuals to see the strengths in themselves. I think they're so used to hearing things from professors or from teachers or family members. Sometimes they're just used to hearing things from a deficit perspective, that it can be really helpful if they can kind of see the strengths that they possess. And some of those strengths include having very average to superior intellect. So again, being smart, being able to succeed academically. They can have a very passionate commitment to ideas, which ties into this strong sense of equality and justice. Many individuals on the spectrum really feel that things need to be fair for everybody. And I really admire that commitment that they often have. They may be very talented in one specific area, and that can vary from person to person. But if that talent they have can really be reinforced and highlighted, it can do a lot to help with an individual's self-esteem and their sense of self-competency. They may be very diligent, excuse me, with routine work and have good memories. They may have a strong pursuit of knowledge with areas of interest, as we talked about. My son is very interested in history. I shared this story. Tina knows that when my son was in 4th grade, he caught an error in a history textbook. It had something to do with the dates of Washington something. And my son said, "These dates are wrong." And his teacher helped him write a letter to the textbook editor, and come to find out my son was wrong. I mean, my son was right. And they all wrote him a letter. The textbook company wrote him a letter and said, wow, we have so many people review this material and it got biased. This is amazing, right? That you caught this. Thank you so much. We'll make sure and make the change. So again, that was something where, he was really recognized for having unique ability. And he still actually has that letter. They can be very good spatial and visual learners. I know for a lot of individuals, and Tina will touch on this with ADHD, for example, they can read a page of information and not be able to provide you much comprehension about it afterwards. But there's accommodation, I don't know if you guys have heard, called text to speech, where they listen to that same page of information, and then they can basically tell you everything it said. And again, that's just due to some processing differences. And I love individuals on the spectrum because I think they can have very original ways of solving problems. I think they can be out of the box thinkers. And again, I think that's something that's really to be celebrated and encouraged. Next, Tina. All right, so as promised, we wanted to talk about some strategies, and we know you guys may be working in a number of different types of settings. And so we tried to provide some settings here that maybe could be adapted, whether you're a school social worker or you're working in an office, in the community. We wanted to provide you with some of these ideas that we found helpful. So we talked about using visual learning tools, pictures, charts, and schedules. When I work sometimes with children on the spectrum, and let's say at school, they have a very difficult time with any changes, sometimes with transitions, we'll put a picture of their school schedule on their desktop, right? So nobody really notices that it's there, but they can look at it and they can kind of feel that sense of order, right? Okay, we're moving through our day. These are the activities. And I mean, I know for myself, I keep a daily list of activities, right? That kind of keep me grounded and feel like I'm on track, and then I'm not going to forget anything. So again, for individuals on the spectrum and for neurodiverse individuals in general, sometimes a visual charts and schedules can be very helpful. Supplementing oral instructions with written instructions, again, just trying to be as inclusive as possible when presenting information, so that individuals, regardless of maybe processing differences, are going to be able to understand the material. Explaining the purpose of a task. Sometimes when I work with adults or even children on the spectrum, explaining, why this is important to do, or why this needs to get done within a certain time frame, can help kind of move forward the completion of that task. If they are a student, as we talked about, maybe looking at asking for accommodations, right? And one thing that Tina and I like to mention is that if you have a child, or let's say you're working with a college student or someone who's just studying, and maybe they had an IEP, the individualized education plan, growing up, that was probably pretty much regulated by their parent, right? From the time they start until they graduate from high school, that's generally overseen by their parent, right? Well, when they go to college, there's FERPA, right? And parents can't call up and do things for their child as they may have done before. So the student on the spectrum, not all students, but some, they may not be used to having to advocate for their own educational needs. And so when they go to college, now all of a sudden, and not that they can't continue to get family support, but they kind of need to be the ones that take charge of their learning and getting accommodations. And they may definitely need support with that. And then lastly, just making yourself as a social worker available for support and consultation. Again, this can apply to a lot of individuals, but sometimes just having the opportunity to vent and share about experiences can be really helpful. I also will do a lot of role playing with individuals on the spectrum, practicing maybe a situation that's coming up for them that they're a little bit anxious about, and practicing it and kind of walking through it, they find can be very helpful. Next, Tina. Okay, so now I have just a couple of more slides, and then I'm going to be turning it back over to Tina. But what we wanted to do here was we wanted to also talk about race and neurodiversity when it comes to college. So the first thing we'd like to say we don't have on this slide is 40% of students on the spectrum who begin college will graduate, and 60% will not. So that's much lower than the graduation rate for neurotypical students, right? So more than half of college students on the spectrum who begin college will not finish. And these challenges are even more difficult for students of color who have autism and who are also going to be entering the college environment. So for students on the spectrum in general, when they're entering college, they'll tell us, and Tina mentioned, we do a lot of research with students at USC on the spectrum. And we ask them about their experience at USC, how they're feeling, how they're doing. We're hoping to make USC a more inclusive campus for neurodiverse students, but they'll also talk about prominent feelings of anxiety, depression, loneliness. They have difficulty managing their workload, their time, sensory input. I know a student told me not too long ago that the USC campus just seems really big and loud and overwhelming. He actually used the word bombastic, which I'd not heard in a long time, but that's how he saw the campus, right? Just too much for him. And he didn't like to be on campus because it was so loud and so many people and just very overwhelming. So for students, for neurodiverse students of color, We looked at a study that was conducted by Joy Banks out of Howard University, and she found that while greater access to post-secondary education has increased for many individuals with disability, the benefits of college degree completion remain unrealized for many African American students with learning disabilities. And so as we go on to the next slide, this was a really important topic that Tina and I wanted to bring up, which is it's hard enough for neurodiverse students and neurodiverse students who are on the spectrum, and it's even more challenging for neurodiverse students on the spectrum of color. And as Tina mentioned, our colleague Marisol Marroquin at Rutgers did her doctoral research, and she particularly focused on the Latinx community. And we just thought it was really important to share some of the information around this topic that her research yielded. So she found out that far less is known about adults on the spectrum from BIPOC communities. So as Tina mentioned, right, research on autism has focused for so long and almost exclusively on white males. So individuals of color and individuals of females have really been neglected and left out of the autism research. It's fortunate that due to our colleagues and others, this is beginning to change, but there is a desperate need for autism research to include females and individuals of color, hearing their perspectives and their experience. Most research and clinical efforts continue to have majority white male clients and participants within childhood ranges. So this again is talking about what we just mentioned, and also including more adults on the spectrum in the research as well. And then she found that people who are Latinx and autistic are at an increased risk for discrimination and have other unique social and cultural factors that impact their health and quality of life. So again, Marisol would talk about just this idea that if you are on the spectrum and also have autism, there will be additional challenges you face in terms of getting services, even getting a proper diagnosis. Okay, all right, so Tina, can we go to the next slide? And I think this is this is going to be my last slide, Tina. I'm going to turn it back over to you. So given the research that our colleague came up with, we also wanted to be very solution focused and look at, what could we do to address some of these disparities, right? So for example, one of the disparities, and I don't think we have this mentioned elsewhere in the presentation, Tina, is that a child of color who is on the autism spectrum is more likely to be diagnosed with something like conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, when in reality it is autism, right? So there's a real need for social workers, for us as a professional community, to look at the ways we diagnose autism across populations to make sure we're doing that in a very fair, objective way. As a profession, we talk about promoting neurodiversity, which again, this committee through NASW is a perfect opportunity to promote neurodiversity. USC has a Trojans for Neurodiversity Club, which is a student-run organization that is made up of students, neurodiverse students who are advocating for their inclusion within the larger campus environment, creating safe spaces. So I know at USC, we have a facility called the Korshak Learning Center. So there's some quiet spaces that neurodiverse students can go to kind of when they need a time out, right? when they need a break kind of from the simulation of the environment. Something that Tina and I do is we provide a lot of training and consultation to fellow faculty members. So if they're dealing with a student on the spectrum and maybe there's some challenges in their internship, Tina and I will provide training. We'll try to step in, provide assistance. We're also looking at recruiting and developing placements that really welcome and encourage neurodiverse students to apply. We have an internship at a school that serves students on the spectrum, and the practicum instructor is on the spectrum himself and provides a great role model for an intern on the spectrum. We're really looking at creating diversity-friendly social opportunities and spaces, investing in wellness care that is informed about intersectionality. And lastly, what Tina and I are doing too is we're really trying to bring individuals with lived experience more into our trainings as well. So Tina and I have a colleague who identifies as being autistic, and she will typically join us for these trainings, right? Because Tina and I know we can present from the perspective of, oh, being parents or having worked with the population, but there's so much when you bring individuals with lived experience to the conversation. So I've done some trainings with my son, right, where he's given presentations as someone with lived experience, and others have supported us with that as well. So that's another way that we're trying to bring neurodiversity and intersectionality more to the forefront of these conversations. With that, Tina, let me turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Before I get to the slides on ADHD, we had a couple questions come up in the chat box, and I would love to also get your feedback too. The first one was about who is the best kind of professional to test or assess autism. I had put in the chat box, I know at the regional center, we have licensed clinical psychologists that do the assessment and testing for autism, but they also do rely on other sorts of reports if available, like from a physician or school records, again, if they're available. And I know here at USC, we also rely on, licensed psychologists, but the hard thing can be covering the costs of assessment can be really hard for students, and there's a long waiting list. So Deborah, could you answer or bring up your feedback about that question in your experience?
Sure.
I want to make sure that question is being answered by our participant that asked it. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, no, definitely. I agree with Tina. I think the best route, if you think that it may be autism, would be to go through the regional center. And the reason I mention that is not only is that going to give you a diagnosis, but then it is also going to give the individual access to regional center services. So my son has been a regional center consumer, which is what they're called at regional center, not clients, but consumers. So he's been a regional center consumer since he was 3 years old, and has gotten a number of valuable services through them, such as social skills training groups. It's interesting with school psychologists because sometimes school psychologists are not actually licensed clinical psychologists. And so they can give a diagnosis of autistic-like behaviors, but they can't actually give a diagnosis of autism because they're not able to conduct the battery of tests that are required for autism. So again, I think if you go, and it doesn't mean that another clinical psychologist in the community couldn't make the diagnosis, of course they could, but I think you're kind of killing two birds with one stone if you go to regional center, because you're going to get the diagnosis, you're going to have psychologists who are very experienced. My son went into the office And, you know, 5 minutes in, she said, you realize your son is on the spectrum. And she went ahead and did all the other tests, right, that she needed to do. But she was absolutely right. And she was able to recognize it that quickly because of his behaviors. And then again, you get the diagnosis from a licensed professional, and you also then begin the process of being able to receive services. So I hope that answers your question. And you know, something I was going to mention too really quickly, Tina, if I could.
Sure, go
So
ahead.
really quickly, I had forgotten. So my son is graduating from UC Riverside, right? And we were very proud to find out just a couple of weeks ago that he was accepted into the graduate history program at Columbia. So very proud of him and for how hard he has worked, right? But then here goes the accommodations process all over again, right? Because his IEP, which he used in high school, was not recognized by his undergraduate program, had to start it all over again. And now with Columbia, we're going to have to go through this accommodations program process all over again, right? And it's slightly frustrating because I don't know anybody that's been cured of autism. I mean, my son had autism 4 years ago. I have no doubt that he still has it today. But Columbia, like other universities, are like, oh, we need everything redone. And as Tina mentioned, I'm looking at having to spend about $3,000, right, to get a new psychological evaluation. And the amount of papers and policy and procedure that you have to read through to understand the accommodation process can be very challenging, right? And my son is like, oh, Mom, you know, why do we have to do this again, right? But we do, because that's the way the system is set up right now. So again, when Tina and I talk about getting accommodations, just keep in mind, it can be a very long, complicated, and costly process. USC told us, oh, you know, we can do a psychological evaluation for free, but there's a year-long wait list, right? So that's not going to help a student that needs accommodations in the fall. So just know that we talk about this, but there's a lot of hard work, right, that goes into the process of getting accommodations and just finding professionals even willing to do it because of how cumbersome it is. Okay, thank you, Tina.
Oh, no, thank you so much, Deborah. And also, I did include in the chat box the link to the regional centers throughout California. Again, by law, they're funded. Many of you probably know they're funded by the Latterman Act. So by law, they have to assess you, and they usually do. They do an initial intake, and then if they feel like that there could be there is a need for testing, then they refer to testing. And then throughout the process, you also can appeal as well. And as Deborah says, once you're in the regional system, you can receive services throughout your life. You know, they do tend to look for,
and those services, I'm sorry, Tina, fortunately,
Yeah.
the regional center services are all free of charge.
They're all
That's
free of
a wonderful thing. No,
Yes.
no
Yeah.
fee for the regional center.
Yeah, definitely. There's no fee. However, for some services, they'll see if it's first covered by your health insurance or by the school. And then the regional center is called the payee of last resort.
Mhm.
But you know, this is all for, you know, California. I know when I worked at South Central Los Angeles Regional Center, we also for those who did not have documentation status in California, they were also covered by the services. So so anyway, just a wonderful resource for California residents or those who reside in California.
And
Okay.
Tina,
Oh, good.
Tina,
Yes,
I'm
absolutely.
sorry. No, I was just going to add because I saw someone typed in the chat box,
Yes.
what a barrier. I think that's what I saw. I'm sorry, you guys, I just saw, and I think it was referring to the cost. And, you know,
Yeah.
when I mentioned the 3,000, right?
Yeah.
That's a colleague, well, a former colleague of mine who has worked with Daniel before. And, you know, I have the privilege, right, that I can help Daniel cover that cost,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But if you think about, you know, the number of individuals or students who just simply could not come up with $3,000,
Yeah.
right, to cover an evaluation, and then may just bypass asking for
Yeah.
services they're entitled to,
yeah,
you know, because they can't afford the cost. It just doesn't seem fair
yeah.
to deny someone services they're entitled to because, you know, they can't come up with the cost. But I'll get off my soapbox. That's my
No,
next
I
mission in
agree.
life. Free testing for all
I
accommodation.
agree. And then the regional
That's my
center,
goal.
there's the regional center appeal process. If you go to intake, they have to by law do an intake with everybody that steps in the door. They have to, but they don't have to like refer to testing. So there is a process throughout the whole thing, you know. So, and then also too about, we're going to have some resources at the end, because I know there's some questions about what about evaluations in other states and so forth like that. I mean, there's there's organizations that are like national organizations. Some are more popular than others that you can go to for resources. I think we put information there about Autism Speaks and some other on our slides, but also we'll include our information at the end. What I'll do is we'll put it in the chat box, as well as we also will say that we'll include our information verbally to out loud, because I want to be cognizant of those that might have vision issues that may make it difficult to see the chat box. So I just want to make sure we're accessible. So we'll make sure to do that at the end and to reach out to us. And then maybe we can connect to some good resources for you. Yeah. Okay, so we're going on to ADHD. So, so again, then there's many different kind of neurodivergent areas when we talked about that umbrella. So today we decided to focus on ones that we tend to see more commonly. Not to say that other ones, like for example, I spoke to you about some of the learning disorders like dyslexia that we see, you know, especially many, I know my daughter was diagnosed in at school, but we're going to again focus on autism today and ADHD. So again, I know back when I got licensed, we had ADHD and ADD. Well, we no longer have that. So the DSM-5, with the changes with the DSM-5, has just ADHD. So that's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They no longer have the attention deficit disorder, but they do have different kind of categories here. Predominantly inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive, and it combined. And again, this is from the DSM-5, is again, inattention is that difficulty staying on task, sustaining focus, and staying organized. And then again, the hyperactivity has the hyperactivity and the impulsive. Hyperactivity may seem to move about consistently, including in situations when it's not appropriate, or fidgeting, tapping, or talking. And again, we see here some differences between, you know, the kind of what we see in children, what we see in adults, maybe kind of this restlessness, maybe kind of talking too much. Again, this is from the DSM-5. So again, they're going to focus kind of on the symptoms. When we do our presentation, again, we talk about what we see as clinicians and what we see also as educators, but we're also going to focus on strengths as well. So impulsivity, again, kind of that focus about, you know, self-control, delaying gratification, again, from the DSM. And again, just some different types of impulsive, what they characterize as impulsivity, maybe kind of interrupting others and so forth. And then that combined. So the reason we like to make sure we go over the DSM-5 criteria is just to kind of give us a foundation as we go into our presentation. I know, for example, in some areas, such as schools, even though they do need to get testing from a psychologist to get ADHD for services, our, you know, school social workers don't diagnose. So this is some statistics here that I think are always helpful, and also can give us, I think statistics can also give us kind of room for looking at, what we might need to explore further if one of our interests is where there might be gaps in services, or where we might need to just kind of understand more some of these statistics through research. So again, this is back from 2018 CDC. Children so about a little bit over 9%, 9.5% of children 2 to 17 years of age have been diagnosed with ADHD. Again, boys are more likely to be diagnosed than girls. And, having worked in schools before, doing social work, I definitely have seen this more. Again, maybe we also, like our other diagnoses that fall under neurodiversity, we might want to again look at that a little bit more. Is there been some underdiagnosis, things that we're not seeing? Again, you'll start to see with those diagnosed in childhood, we'll start to see we'll continue to have symptoms into adulthood. Again, neurodiversity is not something you ever get rid of. Again, I think in the past there's a thought, oh, we have to cure, quote unquote cure. But again, I think what Deborah and I are really trying to emphasize, and we do this with especially with groups that may not be as knowledgeable as you, because I know we're with many like-minded individuals with a lot of knowledge and maybe some lived experience. We really kind of try to emphasize that, neurodivergence and neurodiversity is part of one's identity. And again, is a very positive part, or can be a positive part of a person's identity. So we really try to emphasize that. So roughly 1 in 9 college students today has an ADHD diagnosis. I know at USC, when we look at accommodations, and Deborah and I have gotten presentations as faculty members about the accommodations we see, we definitely see most of those fall under like learning disorders as well as ADHD are the ones that students request the most for accommodations. And then there's some other some increases here. Privately insured U.S. women aged 15 to 45 who filled a prescription of ADHD increased, and you'll notice that by 350%. So again, some interesting statistics to look at. Okay, so again, I also want to thank one of our colleagues who actually has ADHD and actually really helped us with these slides based on her lived experience. This particular colleague was not diagnosed as a child and was later diagnosed as an adult, which is really helpful for her understanding, and also to really make sure she was in the right setting for her in terms of her work and how she could advocate at work as well. But myself, having done mostly clinical work with children, has always been my interest, children, youth, and families. I definitely worked with a lot of children that were diagnosed with ADHD. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here because I know you are all talented social workers. I think for myself, and I know Deborah as well, when working with children referred from Department of Children and Family Services, we'd always be careful in terms of making certain diagnoses like ADHD, making sure we're not overlooking or misdiagnosing something that is more related to trauma. So I think that's always a small caveat I always, think about. And that's why we always made sure that we would refer out to have a psychologist, make sure to have the appropriate diagnosis for ADHD when we were able to. Okay, so to do the psychologist to do testing. So again, that it fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes. Again, nothing to do with intelligence. One story of a boy that I was working with that took one of the standardized testing and to go from one grade to another, and did not fail the standardized piece that had to do with math because it was fractions and decimal points, and he forgot to include the decimal point. Nothing to do with his ability or his intelligence, but all to do with not having the appropriate accommodations, being timed, as well as being in a room where there was a lot of distractions. once this particular individual is moved outside of into a room with no distractions or very limited distractions, was given extra time, was fine. But again, nothing to do with intelligence. Difficulty sustaining attention, not seeming to listen. Having a hard time following through on instructions, especially instructions that take a lot of steps. Difficulty organizing tasks and activities, restless or fidgets with hands. Again, avoids or dislikes tasks that require sustained mental effort. So again, this is where some interesting research has kind of come up more about perfectionism. That was definitely not necessarily something when I first started working with children with ADHD that I thought about. I didn't think about this ability to kind of hyper-focus and be a perfectionist. I felt more like I tended to look more for those, what we're seeing, what I got, what I have gone through here, such as not having close attention and not being able to sustain attention. But in some instances, it can definitely be that procrastination might be due to that kind of perfectionistic tendencies. So there can be some sustained mental effort, but it can be hard because of those tendencies for perfectionism. Difficulty waiting or taking turns, blurts at answers, interrupts. I don't know how many groups I did when working with children with ADHD. I know many of you may have had this as well, where you've done groups about some of those social skills, taking turns. One group I did, a little anger management group with some of our children, and we tended to have more children with ADHD in this particular group. We really did a lot of our practicing was that kind of stop, breathe, think, and then act, really giving them those strategies for being able to just kind of wait in the moment and not to act out on anger, which again was good for all the kids. So that was something we also brought to the general, all the school population. Easily distracted by stimuli, like Deborah says, maybe with our children, adults who are neurodivergent, have such a talent in ways of being sensitive to stimuli that we may not necessarily be sensitive to. That can make it hard and difficult in certain situations, but also, can definitely be a strength. And I know a long time ago, I was doing a presentation. Deborah knows this story, a gentleman who's an amazing gentleman on the autism spectrum, wrote a book about his experiences, and his name is Dr. Shore, and we did a presentation. He did a presentation, was a keynote speaker. It was in Alaska in the middle of December, but I remember back then we were using overhead projectors, okay? Overhead projectors for somebody on the autism spectrum, really, really hard because you're hearing that constant humming with overhead projector. So that was a real learning for me because I had not realized, even with my work with children on the autism spectrum, that I had not realized about that, like Deborah said, with the lighting, the overhead projector, how noisy and distracting those can be. So in order to do that, he had to practice. He had to practice a lot to just be sensitive when he was working to be able to deal with those situations. When he was not working, he did not want to go to any place that had certain lighting. So that was important to him. So he could kind of let his guard down a little bit. Again, that what I talked about with procrastination and a lot of work we also do as social workers, the challenges with self-esteem and relationship challenges. A lot of the things like Deborah did speak about our social skills group. We did use a curriculum from Autism Speaks. I think it's a really good curriculum. Actually, Deborah introduced me to it. And it's a type of curriculum that can also be transferred to other situations in terms of social skills. How, again, with self-esteem and how we make friends and keep friends. So that could be a nice resource if people want to look at it. It's called the Model Me curriculum. Also, some things you might notice or hear about in the work or school setting. Again, that kind of distractibility, impulsivity, hyperactivity, memory challenges, especially for deadlines, boredom and time management difficulties. And again, what we talked about, that procrastination and perfectionism, I know right now I mostly do, teaching right now. And I know one thing that we have Deborah and I have a number of students that always come through with, asking for accommodations. And again, they can get an accommodation, but they do not have to share it with a faculty member. It's up to them. But a lot of these accommodations we do get is for like time and a half or extra time with projects. And I know that, again, the kind of long-term projects can be really overwhelming. Again, and some more research has definitely shown that maybe it is because of these, perfectionistic wanting to do a really good job, and this perfectionistic tendencies that might lead with procrastination or just feeling overwhelmed about how to do a project. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Again, that kind of timeliness, or what I talked about before, detail issues. There's some information we're not going to go into in detail that because of time, we'll make sure we have time to do our vignette and for questions, but there is a research right here under social challenges with coworkers, kind of talking about some of those relationship issues, and also and it's not because of, I don't want to put blame on those that have ADHD who are workers, but also kind of a lot of misunderstandings by coworkers, about how we can be more inclusive in the work environment for those with ADHD. So that's some really good, that link right there, chad.org is a good link to go to look at that, and just how we can be more sensitive as coworkers to those that have ADHD within the work setting. I know Deborah and I were very honored for our coworker who was able to share her experience being in a work setting and having adult ADHD, and really kind of having her explain kind of what her process, what she was going through, and how we might create a more inclusive environment. So, but it took her speaking out to do that. So we all have a role, and maybe we can do more. One that she brought up again is about rejection sensitivity. In my work, I had not seen this before. Again, I saw self-esteem issues, a lot of self-esteem. I think for our children in schools, I think part of it is when receiving services, you're pulled out of the classroom. All the kids kind of know. And then also too, with behaviors in the classroom some teachers don't respond in the best ways sometimes to certain behaviors in the classroom because maybe they don't have that experience of being able to, having worked with a child with ADHD. So it could create that environment that seems punitive to children. So that's where the self-esteem is really good to work with. But one area for adults that she shared with us is about rejection sensitivity. Due to, factors related to the brain and neurodiversity, that, taking situations that might be ambiguous, like a social situation, but instead of kind of being able to look at it like, well, maybe that person didn't approach me or didn't call me back or didn't look at me directly or whatever, because maybe we might think that, hey, they may be busy or they might have something on their mind. A person who might be have ADHD might see it as something that's kind of rejecting, okay? And this is where some CBT work might be helpful, but they've seen this more in the research, which was interesting. So it might be an area that might be of interest to some of you to look up if you do work with adults with ADHD or have lived experiences or others within your life. So again, some of the strengths of those with ADHD is again that ability to hyperfocus and that perfectionism. I have one student right now I'm working with who has ADHD, and she is like the best researcher, the best person when you need to get details, which seems to be sometimes contrary to what we think about with ADHD with children. But she just has a real strength, and they see that in her placement and have really actually have given her a lot of praise about that, and also have listed that really as a strength. In other areas, she's struggled because of what kind of organization and deadlines, which again, we'll talk about some strategies. But that's definitely a strength. Resilience, creative and innovative, like Deborah said. We see that a lot with those neurodiverse clients we work with, funny and courageous. And we said courageous because I'm sitting here doing this presentation, and I've had experience working with clients with ADHD. I have friends as well as colleagues with ADHD, but I know whenever we've done these presentations, we've had somebody shared about their lived experiences. We have people, and it can be really hard, really, really hard to be working as an adult with ADHD and to be misunderstood and to have a lot of struggles because work settings aren't inclusive, as well as with our children. So we always want to make sure that there's a lot of courageous people out there that really either are courageous in sharing with others or courageous in advocating for services. Again, but then it also comes with the social intelligence, insightful, empathic, really good conversationalists, really good ability to speak and share verbally, which I see that in my classrooms too. And I've seen that when I've worked with clients. And again, that kind of ability to be spontaneous and energetic. So again, some good strengths. So anyway, what we want to do here is just give you a brief kind of overview of some strategies. I know, as Deborah was saying, we know that there's a lot of individuals here that might, work clinically, might be here because of lived experiences too, as a social worker. I also work in school settings, organizational settings, might be instructors, faculty. I think these can be ones that we can use in clinical practice, which I've used in clinical practice, as well as teaching, presenting information, different modalities, for example, visual and auditory. This is always a reminder for me that we need to be really sensitive about not only including inclusive teaching environments, but also inclusive environments when we're doing work with clients. I know when I worked with children with ADHD, again, I was working with children, so we used a lot of creative arts and arts expression and so forth, but that also can be moved into working with adults with ADHD too as well. So yes, doing the talk therapy, but I know again with children using more of that expressive arts for them to be able to express themselves. I'm being clear about deadlines and help with a timeline to avoid procrastination. I know there's all different timelines that you can use, but again, that using those visual skills to and also breaking down assignments so they feel more manageable. And again, the note-taking sort of piece, this is more for classrooms, but really being cognizant. I know as an instructor, I always have my PowerPoints and notes that I give to all my students, even though my students I see that do have ADHD are able to get a note taker. But again, I want to be inclusive. And by providing that inclusive environment, giving that to everybody, as well as those that have accommodations. So again, allowing brief breaks with individuals, stand up as stretch, again, that neurodiversity. Again, being respectful of all accommodations, again, that being sensitive to that managing stimuli that might be in the environment. So like a quiet location to work and tackle one task at a time. I know one thing that we've really tried to do through the autism work that we've done is they're doing some work on trying to find places within the university setting, USC setting, where there can be places that are, I don't want to say stimuli free, but less stimuli. So little quieter areas that our neurodivergent students can go to get a break from what is a very overwhelming campus environment for them. So that's one thing that we've done. I know with my work with students, clinically, and I know many of you may also work with children and students, is a lot of the work I did with ADHD, which I discussed before, was again, working on self-esteem issues, friendship issues, also working with the teacher in collaboration for like organization and classroom behavior. I think one thing, again, I really recommend Model Me. Autism Speaks with some of their friendship curriculum is really good, as well as the social skills curriculum. I know when I work specifically with children, I always felt that the groups we could do with peers, they may be a little harder to do sometimes, but they definitely really had a lot of really ended up being a lot of growth for our for the students. But I know one thing with neurodivergent individuals you work with is that you really definitely work in more of a multidisciplinary way. I know when I was working at the regional center, we had a multidisciplinary team that we worked with clients, consumers that we saw that involved an OT, speech therapist, as Deborah was saying, psychologists. So again, that focus on working in that multidisciplinary way. But I want to turn it over to Deborah now for her discussion of grief and loss, and then we're going to turn to a vignette and then questions.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tina.
Oh, you're welcome.
So one of the things that we wanted to talk about is I provide support groups through the Pomona San Gabriel Regional Center that's closest to my home, and that's where my son is a consumer. And I provide grief and loss groups. So they're not called grief and loss groups, but that's kind of their role. They're support groups, and they are for families who have just experienced or who just received a diagnosis that their child is on the spectrum. And I have groups for parents or caregivers, as the case may be, whether it's parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles, whoever is taking care of the child. And I also do sibling support groups. And doing these groups has been very interesting because I do think, and this could be true for a lot of situations, neurodiversity and other types of losses as well. But I lots of parents will tell me that when they receive the diagnosis of autism, they just kind of go into shock, right? They hear the diagnosis and then they envision that their child is never going to graduate from high school, their child is never going to get married, or their child is never going to have a normal life, right? They just become overwhelmed with these types of thoughts. So in these support groups, we do a lot of psychoeducation, right, about what autism is and what it isn't. A lot of parents, in my experience, also will experience a lot of feelings of guilt. Did I do something to cause this? Is this my fault? Some families feel ashamed. They're afraid that their child is going to be rejected within their own family or their community. I know my son grew up being bullied, and children who are neurodiverse, particularly children on the spectrum, are at a much higher rate of being bullied. And that's something to be aware of when you're working with individuals and families. So again, providing that psychoeducation to parents or caregivers, providing a safe environment where they can be with other parents who are going through many of the same experiences they are, where they just have a chance to share in a very non-judgmental environment. Parents and caregivers also give each other great resources and ideas. You know, I went to this agency or I tried this. So they provide support, but they also provide practical experience to each other as well. And with the siblings, those groups are very interesting because lots of times what I'll hear from the siblings is that, you know, they feel bad because sometimes their sibling embarrasses them, or sometimes they feel angry because their sibling gets all of their parents' attention, and events or activities have to be tailored around the child on the spectrum. And they can feel resentful of that. Or maybe their friends come over and their sibling on the spectrum says something that embarrasses them. So again, with the support groups, it's psychoeducation for the siblings as well, but also giving them a safe, non-judgmental environment where they can talk about their feelings and receive support as well. And it's so important, and I'm sure this is true across neurodiversity, but in a lot of the research they've done with children on the spectrum, they tend to learn a lot better from siblings and peers than they do from adults. Even though the adults are the quote professionals, they learn better from siblings and peers. So lots of times what I will do with siblings is really make them feel like a part of the team and help them to see that they really have a valuable role in being a teacher, even if they're younger, being a teacher and kind of like a support to their sibling. And they really enjoy that. And sometimes, become very protective and really more inclusive, right? And can really help them with some of those feelings. But I just mentioned this because, again, I think autism, again, like many, many things, impacts the entire family. The divorce rate in autism is much higher than the national averages. So just being aware when you're working with individuals on the spectrum, whether they're children or adults, that it probably is impacting many, many relationships in their lives and their interactions with other individuals. And if we can provide support to family members, to community members, to teachers, if we can provide them with support and education, then that's going to do nothing but benefit the individual on the spectrum. And I do have to say, with my son's schools, I was always so amazed that and fortunate that they were very proactive, right? And they did not tolerate him being bullied. I mean, they really took a zero tolerance. And I know that's not true across the board, but it's nice to see that when it happens, and whatever we can do as social workers, right, to foster that that type of an environment, right, where neurodiversity is something to be celebrated, right, will be important. Okay, Tina, next slide. We've just got one more slide and then we're going to move into our vignette. So here again, we just wanted to mention about looking at some interventions, some goals we can have as social workers when it comes to neurodiversity, and also practicing from a lens of cultural humility. It was interesting. I found that myself on a lot of parents after the diagnosis think, okay, I'm going to go out, I'm going to fight, I'm going to get this, nobody's going to get in my way, nobody's going to deny my child anything, right? And that can be a good attitude to have. But I also found that when I really tried to team with the professionals working with my son and really tried to educate them and support them along the way, we made a lot better progress, right? I remember one teacher telling me, I didn't sign up to be a special education teacher, right? I'm supposed to be general ed. Therefore, I'm not supposed to have a child on the spectrum in my classroom, right? She ended up being one of my son's best teachers, right? But that's because of the fact that we teamed together and learned together and supported each other. So I think as social workers, collaborating and doing that with other professionals, as well as encouraging our clients, of clients who are either neurodiverse or family members, will be helpful as well. So with that, Tina, why don't we go over to the next, which is the vignette. And what we wanted to do was, this is a vignette. This is a client. Tina and I are both going to facilitate this discussion. This is a client who I saw not too long ago. So just to share this, a parent has brought their 10-year-old child in to receive services at your agency. We left that kind of broad, so hopefully you can apply it to your work environment. The child has been diagnosed already with ASD and ADHD. Their parent reports that their child has difficulty making friends, is stubborn, is not able to concentrate in the classroom, and often procrastinates. As a social worker, what might be some interventions you would suggest? So we'd like you to maybe just draw on your own experiences, maybe some of the information you've obtained from this training, and then maybe Tina type their responses in the chat box.
Yeah, I was
Or
thinking,
if someone raise, I don't know if someone would like to.
yeah, I
if
mean,
they
a
can raise
couple.
their hand and share as well.
Yeah, I was thinking,
Great
whatever
to
you
hear
feel
from you.
comfortable with, you'll be able to
Yeah.
unmute yourself, even though
Yeah.
muted. So yeah, you're able to unmute yourself, but please also, if you feel more comfortable in the chat box, please do that. And again, always take a moment, to think about this and then share. So whether you want to do it in the chat box or raise your hand. But I see Annette has raised her hand. Yes, Annette.
Hello, everyone. I
Hi,
am
Annette.
here in Maryland.
Oh,
wow.
wonderful, Annette.
And
I apologize. We've been talking a lot about California regional centers.
yes, I'm here in Maryland.
Oh,
And one
okay.
of the first things I would want to know is the family's ethnicity and the family composition.
Yeah.
That is one of the first things I would want to know. And the reason, again, based on what I'm learning, are there siblings? And if there are siblings, is this the youngest, the middle, or the oldest child? I would also want to know the parents' availability. Do both parents work? Does only one parent work? I would also want to know, is a child in a public or private school setting? And so I would want to spend a lot of time understanding parents' availability and willingness to intervene, or do they see this child as a problem?
It's interesting, Annette, what you're saying is here in California, at least, my daughter is part of a Los Angeles Unified School District public school. So when she was diagnosed with dyslexia and some other processing issues, she got such good services at the school setting because she's at a public. It's much harder at a private, doesn't have access. And again, that's LA Unified School District, which is a really big school district. But I think all the other stuff kind of about family composition and really good assessment and finding out if they, whether the child sees it as an issue or the parent sees it as an issue, I think is so important. I know sometimes with our children that are neurodiverse, it can be a lot. And Deborah probably knows this as well, about for some of our parents to be able to take them to different appointments. At the regional center, we always would have a lot of services for these children that they're available for, that California has, due to this Latterman Act, they pay for. But again, it does necessitate a parent being able to, or a caregiver, to drive and transport and go to different places, which can be really kind of limiting for some of our parents. And again, race and ethnicity is so important to address too as well, and culture. So thank you. But also I was thinking, Annette, when you said that, yeah, Deborah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add, it was interesting when you talked about wanting to know the race and ethnicity of the family, right? So my husband was actually born and raised in Mexico, so he identifies as Latinx. And I noticed there was a very different reaction from my side of the family as opposed to his side of the family when we received the diagnosis, right? And again, not wanting to stereotype, because this certainly doesn't mean that all families react in the exact same way. But I was like, oh my gosh, I immediately went into helicopter parent mode and had to have him involved in 15 services, and everything always had to be an intervention, right? And my husband was much more relaxed, oh, that's just who he is. You're making too much out of this. So and I think that was partly cultural and also, cultural in terms of our individual families and just the ways that we look at things. But it was interesting because we were kind of able to, reach a happy medium, right? Where I backed off a little bit in my intensity, right? Where every single thing has to be an intervention, and I was wearing my son out and wearing myself out. I backed off a little bit from that. And he also acknowledged that, his own feelings, right, regarding accepting this and knowing that this isn't anybody's fault, right? Nobody did something wrong, nobody was bad. This isn't some type of a punishment or something like that, right? And I was going to share, Tina, I saw in the chat boxes, I saw
Yes,
there were a
please.
lot of suggestions for referrals to support groups. I saw Chad, that is a huge organization within the ADHD community. My daughter, who has ADHD, participated in some support services or some support groups herself. So those were some great suggestions I saw in the chat box about the support groups.
Yeah, and just wonderful, good clinical skills here, knowing about kind of, strengths and interests, but also would like to know what strategies or services the family has tried. I think that's really important, what worked and what did not work. I think that that's so important because I know, like, at least here in California, with the regional centers, there's all different types of services. There's support groups, there's in-home supportive services, there's all different types. And so really what would be the best and what would work for the family. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Tina, one thing I was going to say too,
Yeah.
and Annette made me think of this when she was sharing, calling in from Maryland, is I know
Yeah.
that California
Yeah,
does have a pretty good
we do. We do. Yeah.
service system
Yeah,
established through regional center and also through the schools. So, we do want to acknowledge that in other states, I've talked to parents in other states, and I was talking to someone, I think it was in Colorado or New Mexico, and it's a little bit more difficult,
Yes.
right? Because they don't have a regional center per se. They have a structure through their Department of Developmental Services, but everything is just kind of blended into one
Yeah.
large agency. So we do want to acknowledge that it might be a little bit more difficult to access resources in other states. So as Tina mentioned, we'll share our information, and even if there's even a little research we can do, right? We have colleagues in other areas of the country to try to, maybe we can reach out
To do,
to
because we
some of
make
our
it very,
colleagues, see if we can find resources. We'd be happy to do that.
yeah, we very focus, because our presentations are primarily in California. We have focused more in California, but that would be good. I think there's some other great things. I think Helene said, really kind of breaking down tasks is important. And then
Yes.
Chester, I think, is really helpful. Yeah, and I think this is for all our neurodivergent individuals, but also with ADHD, is that human beings are in a continuum in their ability to focus. ADHD is just one side of the continuum. And I agree so much because and it can change too. I know for my daughter, very early on, when she started her IEP, or individualized education plan, that's what we call it in California, is her ability to focus was definitely not what it is today, as being in sixth grade, as being diagnosed with dyslexia and some processing. Maybe that has been part due to additional supports or just her growth. But you're right. I think it's good to kind of look at it in kind of looking at that spectrum. Yeah, it's really important. Yeah. Thank you, Chester and Helene. Deborah, I wonder, it's like 11:50. I wonder if we should end today and let people do the post test before they leave. And I can
Yes.
bring that up, or just to see if before we do that, see if anybody else has any more questions before I go to the post test.
Yeah. Thank you all for
Yeah.
participating. I appreciate you putting up with my cold. I'm sorry you had to listen to me all sick here, but thank you.
Thank you
And
very much. And I
yeah,
know
if you
also
have any
too.
other
Oh
questions,
yeah.
or if not, yeah, one
Oh,
cute
Deborah,
story I
really
kind
quick.
of.
Oh, Deborah, really quickly, can I
Okay.
answer one question? Yeah,
Sure.
there was a question that Helene, I think there was some slides sent out with an email. If I was understanding the question, please let me know. And I think I don't know if that was the PowerPoint or any additional slides, but I do know I feel comfortable. I know Deborah and I spoke about having this PowerPoint shared. So but were there any other additional slides, Helene?
We shared the whole PowerPoint.
Oh, you
So
did. Okay.
I'm glad you approve it.
Oh, yes, we do. I think we approved it
Okay.
before. But anyway, oh, Deborah, I'll go to the next slide if you wanted. I know you had something else to add.
Oh yes, so we kind of like to end this on, with a happy story. So kind of
And
focus on
Deborah,
our strength base.
our slide is neurodiversity is beautiful. So
Okay, great.
yay.
So
Yes.
I told you my son, being on the spectrum, had different points in his life when he focused on different things, hyper focused on different things, right? And at one point he really was fascinated with traffic signs and what traffic signs mean, right? And he became particularly infatuated with the no U-turn sign. What does that mean? What does that mean? And so when it came around to Halloween, we were talking about costumes. I think that's when Star Wars, he's 22 now. Star Wars was really big. And he told me he wanted to be a no U-turn sign. And I thought, oh my gosh, how am I gonna do this, right? But I thought, well, let me use this as an opportunity to embrace his uniqueness and see his diversity as a strength. So we made a no U-turn costume sign for him, and he actually won that year for most original costume. The school said they never had and probably never will see a no U-turn sign costume, but he won and was very, very proud of himself. So we like to end that way, and just as an example, right, of how as social workers, we can really, parents, family members, whoever, really just embrace and celebrate neurodiversity.
Oh, Deborah, I love that story. It's one of my very favorite stories about your son. And also at ending, please note that again, you have the PowerPoint. There's also some really great resources there listed on the PowerPoint. Some national resources too for those individuals joining us from other states. And thank you so much for joining us. And we also have some references too, if you're interested in some of the literature. And then also